Faith and Force, Religious Values, and the Tragedy of War. I'm Matt Barber, Vice President of Liberty Counsel Action, and joining me again today in studio is Dr. Timothy J. Demy. He's a professor of military ethics at the U.S. Naval War College, the author of over 20 books. And Dr. Demy, welcome back, and thanks again. We talked a little bit yesterday about one of the presentations you gave on the relationship between evangelicals and the state of Israel. You've been visiting with our law students and sharing your insights and your knowledge with them. Before we delve into our conversation today, though, I do want to point out to everyone listening that the views represented by you in our conversation today are solely your own views and do not represent the views of the U.S. Naval War College, the United States Navy, or any other governmental department or agency, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Well, Faith and Force, Religious Values, and the Tragedy of War. This was the title of one of your talks that you gave today. And you've written a blurb here that I think nicely summarizes what we can talk about today and certainly what you've been sharing with the students. The Christian must always balance two competing claims of allegiance: citizenship of the state and discipleship of Christianity. That opening sentence, very profound. Boil that down a little bit for us.
Well, a Christian has dual allegiances. The Christian has allegiances and responsibilities to the state, and the Christian, as a citizen, and the Christian has allegiances and responsibilities to their faith, to Jesus Christ, and those must be balanced. Sometimes they blend very nicely. Sometimes they conflict, and when they do so, the individual, as a responsible moral agent, has the duty to act and follow their conscience, wherever that leads them, in whichever realm that is.
Sure, and that can obviously that inherent conflict and that balancing act, which as you point out, that the two allegiances to one's faith and as a follower of Christ, and to the state and to the government and to law, and they're not always harmonious.
Right. Sometimes
there can be conflicts that arise. And as you pointed out, and we could talk for days about all the possible areas where that friction can occur, but you focus on that conflict really where it can arise relative to war, times of war. We always hear about conscientious objectors and so forth. Unpack that a little bit.
Sure. Well, I think nowhere do those responsibilities become more prominent and prevalent than in times of war. Mm-hmm. And certainly within Christianity, there has been a history and a tradition that is wide and broad. There's a spectrum of views regarding war and peace. Some arguing that pacifism is the answer, others arguing that no, there are other frameworks that can be used. And the Christian must look at issues of war and peace and decide for themselves where they stand on that. Plato was right when he said only the dead have seen the end of war. Yeah. But also I balance that with a statement that C.S. Lewis said, that if war is ever lawful, then peace is sometimes sinful. Lewis, as a proponent of the just war tradition and as a former infantry officer wounded in the trenches of France in the First World War, came to believe that if there is ever a time that you look out at world events and say someone should do something has to happen, then to not do so is not only a moral failure and an ethical failure, but from his viewpoint and the viewpoint of Christianity, it's sinful not to act.
So the sin becomes an act of omission is very interesting. And C.S. Lewis is always one of my favorites, able to boil down an entire thesis into a few short sentences. Very profound stuff. Now, You mentioned the trauma and tragedy of war must never be minimized, and yet through the war tradition, Christians have developed a framework for addressing the spectrum of conflict that affects individuals, institutions, and international relations. What is this framework? What did you mean by that?
Well, it's the just war tradition. It's the just war framework. Some people call it a theory. It really isn't a theory. It's a tradition. And a tradition, a framework for war has to be one that has elasticity, or it has to be like an accordion that can flex with events. It can flex with development of technology. You have to be able to answer issues of low-intensity conflict as well as high-intensity conflict. And over the centuries, within Christianity, there has been this just war tradition that says, yes, we have a framework for addressing war and peace and issues of justice, and we need to apply that framework to current events, and especially when matters of war and peace are at stake.
Well, and I think, we talk a lot, Liberty Counsel does, in particular in Faith and Freedom, about our founding fathers who were vastly were men of faith, primarily Christian men, most of them, not all of them, certainly, but the majority of them were definitely men of faith who were lived at a time when there was a great deal of conflict, obviously, when with the revolution, the U.S. Revolution with our nation, and they had to juggle that conflict. Today we have to juggle that conflict. And I think part of the harmony that you're talking about, within the Declaration of Independence, focuses a lot on liberty. And unfortunately, sometimes in order to maintain liberty, we are put in a position where we have to engage in self-defense. I think that's what our founders did in order to achieve liberty. 10 Commandments, Bible says, thou shalt not kill. There's some argument as to whether it's thou shalt not murder the innocent, thou shalt not kill. How do we parse this self-defense thing with the Christian faith?
Well, it's part of the Christian faith and part of the Christian tradition. And again, the just war tradition really goes back to the time of Augustine and has roots even further back beyond that. But if we're going to start picking and choosing verses, we get into trouble. I liken the just war tradition and verses about war and peace to verses about the idea of paying taxes. If I'm going to pay taxes as an individual, it's one thing. I use one set of forms. If I'm going to pay taxes as a corporation, I use a separate set of forms. And if I mix those two, I get into trouble. And so sometimes when we look at the verses in Scripture, we have to determine who is this verse written for? Does this verse apply to the individual, to the state, to the church? Who is it for? If you get things confused, then you end up in trouble theologically. So we have to, when we look at the biblical text, we have to be very careful to choose our verses and build an entire construct and not just pull one verse out saying thou shalt or thou shalt not, and here's my proof text. Mm-hmm. But the Christian just war tradition has done that over the centuries. There has been a conscientious effort to address all aspects of warfare, all levels of warfare, the complexities of warfare. I mean, today we read the headlines, we see the headlines, and we see issues of piracy. Well, that's not new. Augustine addressed piracy in his volume, The City of God. So the ideas have been there, but we have to apply them, we have to work with them, and adapt them to new technologies, new threats, new issues.
We live in a soundbite generation. The Christian just war tradition. What's the soundbite? What sums that up? And I'm putting you on the spot here. I know what.
I would go back to Lewis's quote that if war is ever lawful, then peace is sometimes sinful.
That's okay.
That sometimes you must act.
Yeah.
You must act to prevent harm, to restore justice.
And
the just war tradition is not about peace, it's about justice. A tyrant has peace.
Right.
A dictator has peace, but they don't have justice. The just war tradition is about restoring justice for people.
And if justice is the catalyst and maintaining justice, then certainly both the government and the church, Christians, can be justified and can reconcile things that might be difficult to do with the Christian faith, but in order to maintain and further the ideas of justice, they
and again, we come back to where we started, that the Christian always balances their responsibility as a citizen and as a disciple. And a Christian may say, in good conscience, I cannot do this. And you mentioned conscientious objectors. Well, we have a political structure that allows for such things. So ultimately, all actions are matters of conscience, but the actions of our hands flow from the attitudes of our hearts.
Well said. Well, Dr. Demy, thank you so much for joining us this week and for visiting Liberty University.
you.
We appreciate it. And folks, thanks for tuning in to Liberty Counsel's program, Faith and Freedom. Go to lc.org to learn how you can become part of Liberty Counsel's ministry, or give us a call, 1-800-671-1776.